We come today to Ritual 1, and our movement in our education has a seasonal pattern. And in a way, our first season of nature was like the beginning of the year, like January, February, March. And in those early times, the beginning of January, usually some of the coldest weather. And in this kind of emotion, the education begins in the bleakness of the unknown. By this time, we're entering into spring. And spring, for us, traditionally, is the vernal equinox. And I thought you might be interested in the old Paleolithic wisdom that led to the fount that makes the tradition of spring not being the beginning of the year, but coming as the second season. When you look at the night sky, outside of the habitual responses of civilization, which constitutes about 6,000 years of habit, when you're able to abstract yourself or extract yourself from civilization long enough to get familiar with the night sky as a primordial, natural medium, in a place where the light from electricity doesn't veil this splendorous cosmos, one becomes aware that in the night sky there are certain stars that are quite special. Most of them because they are large and bright, like Rigel or Capella or Betelgeuse. Some of them because, like Algol, they are fiery in nature. Others because they occupy places in the sky that are special. And of all the stars that occupy a special place in the sky, Polaris, the North Star, is the most special. Because as one gets used to the primordiality of the starry expanse in pre-civilized acceptance perception, one realizes that stars tend to collect into gestalts. Some of the earliest gestalts that are made are the belt of Orion, those three stars that hang together about 900 light years away from here. Or the Pleiades, a cluster of 7 visual stars that later can be resolved into 9 or 12, and finally through a telescope through 50 or more stars. With the belt of Orion, the Pleiades, or the 7 stars that make up the Big Dipper. The Big Dipper, the belt of Orion, the Pleiades, are cues. They're perceptual cues that stars tend to constellate, that they make gestalts. And in the sky, the Big Dipper is one of the most interesting of all gestalts. Its cup tilts towards the northern part of the sky, where there is another constellation, the Little Dipper. Sometimes the Big Dipper is called Ursa Major, the Big Bear, and the Little Dipper is called Ursa Minor, the Little Bear. And in a way, those terms come from Paleolithic times rather than Dipper, time when the bear, the great cave bear, was the archetypal animal, the totem of initiation into the mysteries. Back towards the end of the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago. The last star in the handle of the Little Dipper, the most dominant star in the Little Bear constellation, is Polaris. And Polaris has for many thousands of years seemed to hang in the night sky while all the constellations of the stars make circles around the steadiness of Polaris. One of the most noticeable of all the constellations that finally occurs to you, one which is so enormous that only after long thousands of years of penetrating acceptance of the night sky does one come to recognize the Milky Way. And the great mass of the Milky Way is like a mysterious serpentine dragon across the universe for Paleolithic man. And the hump that goes nearest to Polaris, nearest to the North Star, the Milky Way humps at one point up above 80 degrees, close to Polaris. And at that point, if one drew a gestalt line from Polaris through the hump of the dragon of the Milky Way and brought it down to the horizon of the Earth, where the sunrise and sunset, the moonrise and moonset, where they have an equidistant arch, that line bisects the Earth in what we know today as the constellation Pisces. The vernal equinox is signaled by, is triggered by, is made. The spark of life comes out of the pole star's axis touching another axis, the axis of the horizon of the Earth. And here, where the male vertical line touches the female horizontal line, at that point every year the spark of life is rekindled. And so it became noticeable that there was a four-part, a quaternary quality to the universe at large, to the enormous ensemble of everything, and how a pair of horizons, one accepting and one penetrating, together constituted the first bones of the structure of nature. On this structure, on these bones, the beginnings of ritual comprehension set in for species that preceded us. Our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, preceded by at least a handful of species before us. Homo neanderthal, Homo erectus, back into the mists of time, several millions of years ago. And all through that particular development, the increasing impress that there was some kind of sequential ordering, some kind of energy wave, some kind of a quality of order that held the structure of life in its movement, so that the four-part movement of the cosmos is vivified, is energized with a sine wave of quality of spirit moving through it, so that structure and spirit together were understood to have an interpenetrative quality. One might use the term from biology. The term is osmosis, that there was not a wall between spirit and structure, but there was a membrane, and this membrane permitted an osmosis. And that the health of any individual creature, the health of any individual tribe, the health of any gestalt of beings or super beings, supernatural or natural, the health of the universe as a whole, depended upon the osmosis, the interchange, the exchange, being able to affect itself through the osmotic process of membranes. And that whenever there was a clogging of the membrane so that there was not able to be this osmotic process, illness and finally a terminal death would occur. That this terminal death was somehow different from death as a part of the cycle of life. A cycle of life that eventually was seen to have a 12-part quality, beginning with birth and reaching apexes at various stages and coming into rebirth. So that one had a birth, a childhood, a puberty, adolescence, marriage, maturity, children of one's own, development of tradition, aging, death, transcendence, a rebirth, and the cycle of birth again. And these stages, sometimes the Latin term stadia might be used, or as we have come to use instead of stages, phases. Phases of a process, phases that are facets of form which changes. And so for the Navajo, when they talk about Earth, they talk about Mother Earth as changing woman. And how changing woman, trying to conceive a child with water dripping, came to a point where there was not this osmotic interchange between them, no fertility. And in one adventurous attempt, the sun was brought in as a second male, and changing woman became pregnant with twins. For the Navajo considered that twins meant two fathers. And these twins that were born, one was the child of the sun and became known as slayer of alien gods, became a hero for the Navajo, a mythological hero. And the other became a mythological hero equal to, but somewhat different from slayer of alien gods. These twins, which we will talk about next week in particular, but in the following couple of weeks, are a quality of mythological background that informs the ritual comportment, in this case of the Navajo people, as an example for us of the way in which all beings of our kind comport to nature. Ritual is a ritual comportment that establishes something that is indispensable. What does it establish? It establishes existence. That existence comes into its maintenance, emerges into its isness, and goes through a phase-form cycle and returns back into nature again. So that when one looks at life forms, looks at the way in which our body holds a life cycle in its existence, one has to be attentive for a long while, a whole lifetime, to see this scintillating movement, this phase-form change occur. And just as there is this celestial, double-paired horizon, there is also for us, because of our responsiveness, because of our inclusiveness with this, a similar kind of pair. happening. These, for the Navajo, the divine twins, are a pair. And they add a quality, as we will see, in the way in which all healing ceremonies take place. Now, we're going to use, as a text for the Navajo, Gladys Reichardt's great Navajo medicine men sand paintings that came out in the late 1930s. And Gladys Reichard, one of the really wise American women anthropologists, a whole group of them included Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead and Ruth Underhill and a whole number of genius American women who trained under the aegis of Franz Boas and under the aegis of going out and participating with the tribal people, of living with them on ritual level, led to an acceptance of them in a way in which male anthropologists before that had not achieved. The early English anthropologists, like E.B. Tyler, who established through his book Anthropology the idea of a science of anthropology, of looking at categories, categorizing, looking at the way in which ceremonies and rituals distributed themselves into intellectual ideas of categorization, or the German anthropologists, or other nationalities of anthropologists who followed this same ideational imposition upon the experience. This was countered by a whole generation of American women who did not take ideas with them so much as the desire to understand the people. And among this illustrious group, Gladys Reichard, truly an amazing woman. Her great book, published in the Bollingen series and reprinted now in paperback, first published February 1950, right at mid-century, called Navajo Religion, A Study of Symbolism. This is the first of the original two-volume set. On page 112, under the chapter Theory of Curing, she has these wise words for us. The ritual of curing has an understanding which is not quite like a European theory of logical imposition. And she doesn't mean theory of curing in this kind of a way, but she means theory in the old sense of theoria. The Greek theoria was contemplation, of taking within the understanding, taking within the images so that they mature into the idea, and that this way of understanding led to a remarkably accurate and vital characterization of ritual, quite different from the habit-forming throwaway activity which European masculine anthropology had made almost a de facto trigger response. Here's how theory of curing is poignantly characterized by Gladys Reichard. The ritualistic process may be likened to a spiritual osmosis in which the evil in man and the good in deity penetrate the ceremonial membrane in both directions, the former being neutralized by the latter, but only if exact conditions for the interpenetration are fulfilled. Now, we've run across this before. This remarkable quality that nature, in its phase-form process, does not move to another phase until the previous phase is fulfilled. And by being fulfilled, it's not so much topped up as that it reaches its saturation. And its saturation is reached as an equilibrium. And at this moment, at this point, if you like, at this occurrence of equilibrium, the next phase occurs spontaneously. Out of the saturation, out of the equilibrium of the previous phase. We saw this all the way at the beginnings of nature, when we used the old Chinese Tao Te beginnings. Tao, zero, base of nature. Te, the oneness, the unity of all things. And how when Tao has its equanimity, its saturation, when zero is exactly zero, spontaneously out of it comes Te. One emerges whole out of zero. Doesn't occur in fractions or fractals, but occurs whole. So that one speaks of a universe quite accurately. It is a oneness. And how out of the universe, out of Te, when Te has its fullness, its saturation, its equanimity, comes Gen. And that Gen characterizes our quality, translated usually as human-heartedness, that the heart of human beings, the heart of mankind, is a spontaneous immersion that appears out of the equanimity of unity. And when unity is achieved, when two are brought into equanimity so that an exchange between them can happen, then a birth occurs. When existence has its horizon of equanimity, and there's an exchange with a penetrating horizon, conception occurs. We occur. We emerge out of the mysteriousness of the wholeness of the all. And so all ancient wisdom was characterizing our birth as a moment, a point, a transformation based upon the old ancient principle. When equanimity occurs, the osmosis goes both ways. The powers of heaven and earth come together, and one has a new phase. Gladys Reichard concludes this particular paragraph. She's been talking about spiritual osmosis, about ceremony as a membrane. One condition is cleanliness, the ejection of evil so that the place it occupies may be attracted to good powers. The chanter's ultimate goal is to identify the patient with the supernaturals being invoked. He must become one with them by absorption, by transformation, by substitution, recapitulation, repetition, commemoration, concentration. And in this long list, the two most salient terms are acceptance and transformation. At each node where a phase changes, where a new phase is to come out, acceptance is that equilibrium which establishes itself, and the transformation comes out triggered by the complete acceptance. So one often finds in archaic rituals, wherever a phase of equilibrium has been reached, the participant or participants go off to have a sleep afterwards, go off to have a rest, complete the acceptance by a sleeping, by a resting. And the dream is the first step. It's the first movement in the transformation. The image that comes to one, whatever that image is the cue of the beginning. It's the seed of the next phase, whatever that phase happens to be. And so the attentiveness, which becomes very difficult. One is distracted, and so attentiveness is difficult on that scale. Or one does not believe, and so attentiveness is difficult on that scale. But there is a third scale at which attentiveness is most difficult, and that is, after all of the energy of reaching the point of saturation, of equilibrium, and acceptance has occurred, there is a physiological, an emotional tendency for a letdown, for a coming down. And so one has to prepare oneself not to let this happen, but to keep the acceptance open, to keep it continuous, so that one sleep is a sleep of receptivity rather than a sleep of exhaustion. And this takes being woven into the energy pattern, the sine wave signature of life as a whole. Because only someone who is contexted by the cycle as a whole will have the staying power, will have the evenness of tone, will have the yoga of being able to carry through all of the phase form cycles. If you try to do it one step to another, one phase to another, the difficulties mount up asymptotically, and failure is almost always the result. One does not have complete acceptance. The saturation is not complete. It's a botched job. The ritual doesn't work. The ceremony is ruined. It's flawed. And so one sees in a very practical way the necessity for all primordial peoples, and you can understand why we never call them primitive. All primordial peoples recognized an exactness and completeness necessary in ritual. And to ensure this exactness and completeness, tradition must have its fullness and must be transmissible itself. And so ritual tradition comes to inhabit the same circle that nature has. And as one has a circle of the seasons, one also has a ritual year. The rituals do not slavishly follow nature, but they braid with nature because that's the only way they're real. It's the only way that they are accurate and the only way that they are complete. And that exactness and that completeness and that immersion guarantees that each phase will have its efficacy and that each ceremony will have its good reward. Now, this quality is extremely important when a curing is necessary. It's extremely important for a healing. One must bring the medicine and the wound together in equanimity. Only then is there that osmotic exchange. In the great Mahayana classic, the Bodhikaryavattara, written by poet Saint Shantideva, on the practice of the Bodhisattva, he says the most mysterious of all secrets in the Mahayana is the secret exchange of selves, and that this must be guarded by all of the consciousness, all of the prajna, all of the discipline, all of the virya all of the patience, all of the charity, the dana, the givingness, all of the dhyana, the concentration, all of the sila, the ordering of the bodhisattva. And that only when all of this is brought together, in the case of Shantideva, it was the 6 paramitas, the 6 perfections. Only when they are focused all together does one have an implosive point which regenerates itself spontaneously. If all were not focused together so that the point were perfectly implosive, you would have crushed or maimed situation instead of transformation. So a transformation is always perilous because if not handled rightly, and what's right? What's right is the exactness and completeness which tradition on the tribal level ensures. And we will see one of the great difficulties, one of the great dangers for civilized man is that civilized human beings outgrow the tribal confidence and are faced with a whole new range of problems. Because once you lose the confidence in the tribal tradition, to be exact and complete, one has to understand the entire process from a new angle in order to come up with something that then works for civilized man. And so by and large, for the last 6,000 years, civilized men and women have faced travail after travail because the more sophisticated that the transformations become, the more difficult it is because of not relying on tradition, because of not being able to have confidence in the ritual efficacy. The higher levels are precarious and perilous. And so one finds books entitled Civilization, Its Cause and Cure, in that case by an American named Carpenter. Not the famous John Carpenter of the films, but Edward Carpenter around the turn of the century, a friend of Walt Whitman's. So our education, which began in nature, now takes, one tends to say, a jump, but it's not so much a jump. One emerges into a new phase, and the new phase is ritual. And as nature was characterized by mystery, the mystery of Tao, and ritual can be characterized by existence. And existence comes to reside, for us, most recognizably in the body. So that the body becomes the anvil, the focus, the altar. It becomes the place where the membrane manifests itself. So that the membrane of ceremony has its locus exactly here on the body. And for the body, the place where the window comes through is the face. And so in ritual, the mask becomes for us one of the most important of all concerns, as indeed it was for primordial men and women. The ability to have a mask-making creativity is essential for existence on the level of human beings. We cannot begin to survive without having mask-making creative ability. And so one of the ways in which to affect this season of ritual, we had our season of nature, now we're going to have a season of ritual, and next will come a season of myth. 3 months excursion for each. And we'll conclude the year with a season of symbol. 3 months on symbol. So we have this clockwise motion, this nature, ritual, myth, and symbol, which really are an ensemble. What threads all together, the sutra that sutures all together, is integration. So that the energy mode, the kind of energy that the universe plugs into, is integration. And we will see that it's paired with a different kind of energy, an energy that can only be described as transcendent, supernatural. Instead of being based on nature, that other energy is based on vision, on consciousness. Radically different and yet somehow osmotically related to nature. And so our education will need a second year to go through the 4 seasons of differentiation. For differentiation, differential consciousness, though paired to natural integration, is extraordinarily different. And while in integration one has nature and ritual and myth and symbol, in differentiation one has vision and art and history and science. And all the difficulties that our species have had mastering nature and ritual and myth and symbol are compounded many, many-fold when it comes to vision. And by the time it comes to art, it's staggering in its complexity. And history so difficult that very few human groups have ever even essayed, have tried to deal with it with comprehension. And science so far flung in its true nature as to be almost a distant guiding beacon, almost another star, but not quite. For our generation, fading out of reach, and for the generation before us, tentatively within reach, and for the generation following us, unless we educate ourselves, it won't be attainable at all for a long time. And so this education is not just to learn about, be instructed about, reacquaint ourselves with something past or old or basic, but to prepare ourselves to complete an education which can carry us all the way through, not just the cycle of nature in its circle, but that other cycle, that other, quote, circle that consciousness has as its fullness, as its phase form development. And when you put the two together, you get that infinity quality. An infinity, like zero, factors anywhere in the real. It is a common denominator of any and everything, including the imaginary, including the impossible, including the unreal. And when one comes to enumerate high wisdom, the high Dharma structure of things, one includes many variants of the impossible, the unreal, the unexpected, and the unknown, along with all of the nuances that nature has, and she has many. Someone wise like Gladys Reichard, a woman like Gladys Reichard, was necessary for a whole generation of books, of publications to come out. And by and large, this phenomenon happened in the United States. And by and large, the documentation of this material occurred through United States government publications. The annual reports, the bulletins of the Indian Affairs, these green volumes, now many shelves long, are simply a miraculous reservoir of intelligence and of patience, men and women alike. But the stars of the show were the American women anthropologists. And among those stars, I've chosen Gladys Reichard, and later on we'll use Ruth Benedict also, her great book, Patterns of Culture. These women understood, like changing woman, like the old mythological Earth Mother, that if one is attentive completely through the energy cycles, all of its phase form transformations, one will be able to not only have existence, but to live again. That existence returns in its turn into manifestation. And that this, in a way, is a guarantee of life eternal. And so the stakes are as high as you would wish them to be. Gladys Reichard, to conclude this particular little excerpt, writes, "The purpose of sand paintings is to allow the patient to absorb the powers depicted, first by sitting on them, next by application to parts of deity corresponding to parts of the patient, foot to foot, hand to hand, knees to knees, head to head. In some chance, parts of the dry painting may be slept on to give more time for absorption." And there are many other aspects, but you get the drift, you get the idea. You appreciate the tremendous intelligence of the woman. Now, instead of just using a book, and for the last 2,000 years, the book has been the symbol of comprehension. The book has been the hand of the mind with which we reach out to lay hold and to convey gestalts of differential consciousness. But we live at the beginning of a time where a single book is no longer sufficient, that a single book is actually a regression. And it's not that the book is dead, but it's that the book needs to have a transformation. It's a little premature to talk about CD-ROMs and internets. Let's begin like we began in primordial times. Let's begin by taking first steps. So first steps into a new educational procedure is to take pairs of books. By pairing, this way gives us mobility. And there may be improvements in hundreds of years to come. There may be fantastic discoveries in thousands of years to come. But for 1996, we can begin with pairs of books, by pairing books together. And by judicious selection of pairing, we get a movement that carries us and protects us at the same time. Protects us against an indoctrination, whether intended or not, against an inculcation of habit, whether intended or not. And by pairing disparate books together, one finds a mobile, scintillating focus that requires a little more attentiveness, but one that moves with a creativity. The pair to Gladys Reichard's Navajo medicine man paintings is the sacred pipe, the Black Elk's account of the 7 rites of the Oglala Sioux. So we're using 2 Indian books to begin, 2 American Indian books. Because the American Indian studies, from the end of the 19th century to about the middle of the 20th century, in that 100 years, roughly 1850 to 1950, in that 100 years, American Indian studies transformed the way in which an anthropological outlook occurred. At the beginning of it, there was some kind of finger-pointing categorization based upon previous ideation. And at the end of it, a whole scintillating multiplicity of facets was available. And right in the middle of it, around the turn of the century, around 1900, in the Bureau of American Indian Ethnology volumes, 2 of the volumes that paired together to make, I believe it was volume 39, was the great study of American Indian languages. And it was the study of American Indian languages that led to the science of linguistics, that led to the improvement of the study of language enough to permit the development at the end of the century of computers, for instance. The development of logic to points where modern mathematics is extraordinary discipline. All of this came because the study of American Indian languages condensed into a recognizable gestalt, masterable by individuals within a lifetime of study, the whole range of linguistic activity. The first comparative linguist who was going to study American Indian languages was Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson, while he was president and sending out Meriwether Lewis on his expedition, the Lewis and Clark expeditions, had them make dictionaries of all the Indian languages they ran across the continent, and send copies of these dictionaries in handwritten volumes back to Jefferson, which he collected. And at the end of his presidency, he was going off to Monticello to master the basic hidden language that was there in the comparative revelation of all the American Indian languages, because they were unsullied. They were primordial man's way of expressing himself. The trunk that contained Jefferson's 53 dictionaries of American Indians never made it to Monticello. It was lost en route, and Jefferson never was able to complete his project. That project was completed at the end of the 19th century by people like Franz Boas, and founded the science of linguistics in the meantime, in the course of this. So the American Indians have done a great service to us. One note of interest before the break: the Los Angeles Basin was the point on the planet that had the most linguistic variety of any place on Earth. 20 different families of language were spoken in the LA Basin. More linguistic variety than all of Europe together. And so those of us who live in Los Angeles have to recognize that it was always a, quote, hodgepodge. It never was one thing. Or to put it in a positive light, Los Angeles was always a sparkling jewel of multiplicity from the beginnings. Let's take a break. In ritual, there is always a comportment to existence. And the body is always the focal mediator. Out of this, in a natural way, flows two different sets of problems. The first set of problems has to do with limitations, and the second set of problems has to do with unlimitations. Let's take unlimitations for a second. Unlimitations have to do with a very particular quality, the quality of the supernatural, the quality of the beyond nature, the beyond the natural. So that in ritual comportment, the unlimited is a peril, which is characterized by supernatural beings, by gods and goddesses, by ghosts, by demons, a whole spectrum of supernatural or paranatural. Included in that would be anything abstract, and including in that would be anything magical, and included in that is vision itself and consciousness. So that because of the problems of unlimitedness for human beings in a ritual comportment, one has to deal with this. One needs a helper to deal with this. The helper is the medicine man or the medicine woman. Let's call them the medicine person. In a wisdom education, the teacher very often is medicine person, is a helper. Not the boss, but the helper. Not the emperor, but the shepherd. And so when one of the greatest and oldest of all the wisdom teachings was first put down in writing about 90 AD in Alexandria, the very first writing was called Poimandres, the mind shepherd, and uses a Greek similar to the Greek of the Gospel of St. John. Uses a highfalutin, high Dharma kind of Greek that requires quicksilver consciousness to be able to follow the syntax and nuance and all of this. But even on such a highfalutin level, the action is an action patterned on primordial ritual. And so the problems of even the unlimited perils of multidimensional consciousness have a ritual foundation that must be attended to and cannot be thrown away, cannot be forgotten. But that problem with the supernatural, with the gods, with God, with the divine, with the magical, that whole set of problems is only the problems that could be gestalted and grouped under the unlimited. There are problems of limited also. And the problem is a premature limitation like the ego, or a false limitation that seems to be a workable measure of form like identity and is perilous in the extreme, but is a peril of limited. And so a path of equanimity, life is able to move in a path of equanimity between the perils of, how did Homer put it, Scylla and Charybdis. One of them is a multi-headed dragon that snatches at you to get you this way, and the other is a whirlpool that is nothing in and of itself except its negativity, that takes you down to the black sands at the bottom of the ocean and leaves you there while it covers you up. The unlimited is a peril of the ultimate negativity that leads into blank, unknown nothingness. The perils of nothingness. But on the other hand are the perils of the limited, the premature perils of the ego, the constricting false perils of identification. And those snatch at us prematurely. And so ritual has a wisdom to it. Ritual is not at all some kind of primitive habit, though it can become that, essentially and necessarily, originally, permanently, in its wise regard, ritual is indispensable for existence to occur, for existence to hold and to convey its life. And so life belongs in existence only to the extent and insofar as human beings are able to understand each other through education, through communication, through the tribe, through the tradition, through the exchange, through the body, through the intelligence of the ritual ceremony. Only by that mode does life continue at all. And wrapped up in that quality of indispensability in existence is a quality called experience. And we will see, looking ahead now, looking up, that while ritual concerns itself with existence, myth concerns itself with experience. And yes, there they go together. But there's a third aspect that is also there. It's like buried deep within the center of experience is something called essence, the symbol. And so ritual and myth and symbols always go together. They're an ensemble. But in order to understand on level of curing, in order to get educated on level of being able to go into differential consciousness, one has to take them in a kind of a phase form order, which we're going to take. And why does it take 9 months to do this? Because of my limitations, I can't find any faster way. It takes 9 months because that's the best I can do. And I can only convey to you, to deliver to you, what I hold, what I have, in that kind of graduated time cycle. Because I'm still old-fashioned. I still learned it in the old ancient way, the way in which it's there in the caves, when the Great Bear was the archetype. That's the only way I know it. But I know it well enough to convey it so that it's usable in any situation with any amount of dimensions, no matter how complex a multiverse occurs. It's still viable because you can be taught how to navigate. And that's what this is. It's an education to navigate whatever the medium is. Whether it's an imaginary, hypersonic, omniverse, or whether it's this universe, whatever it is, the same principle holds. Because ritual comportment always deals with action. It's always a doing. And that there's always like the traditional way to call it was a golden thread. There's always a golden thread that links the episodes of the action together so that they form the ancient way. The metaphor was a necklace. So that the mala beads or the rosary beads is a ritual implement of this kind of understanding and wisdom. That the episodes are strung together by a common thread, and the common thread is the essence of the action. And the essence of the action is the doing of the doing. Paying attention, and the way in which an ancient tradition characterized it in Sanskrit language was satipatthana, translates as mindfulness. And in fact, the next pair of books that we have, one of them will be the Satipatthana Sutra. Sutra is thread in Sanskrit. It means the historical Buddha talked in such a precise way that if one followed it, the exigencies of the examples would fall away and one would be left just with the dynamic essence, which would be the thread. And if you could meditate pointedly enough to what point? To one-pointedness. It's called ekagrata in Sanskrit. If you could meditate to one-pointedness, that ekagrata would follow the sutra thread without any embellishment whatsoever. and you would discover that it doesn't move at all. And falling out of the world of Maya, one is left with shunyata, the void, which instantly has tathata occur. And tathata is the very essence of compassion. It's the stuff of existence. And one understands that the world comes spontaneously, emerges. When you look for a causality, there's no causality whatsoever. So that one has to have a different principle. And why then would it happen if causality doesn't occur? If causality is simply an appearance, what's the principle? The principle is reciprocity. And out of such a simple, seemingly simple reciprocity as 0 and 1, one can create a binary language that can run all the computers in the world, and does. Every piece of software or hardware you buy runs on simple 0 and 1 binary, just like Tao Te. Just like high Dharma wisdom runs on shunyata and tathata, because they are complementarities. They have a reciprocity. They exchange with each other at every node of equilibrium. At every node of fullness and saturation, they go to another phase. And that phase form happens. Why does it happen? Because not of causality, but of reciprocity. But one has to grind as fine as Ekagrata and follow a sutra all the way through, like the Satipatthana Sutra, in order to experience that. There it is. On first point of enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, which was only one of 4 trees, spent 7 days. The historical Buddha spent 7 days under 4 trees, and the Bodhi tree was the 4th tree. And upon realization, concomitant to that realization was the recognition that he had nothing to say. For there was no one to say it to, and there was nothing with which to say the nothing to no one. Until 2 merchants, passing merchants, happened upon the Buddha in this state of nirvana. And being practical merchants and recognizing something special, they sat down and they asked him for some teaching that could help them without any guile whatsoever. And spontaneously, impossible though it was, to the Buddha, nirvana, there was no one there on either end, and nothing to say and nothing with which to say. He began to deliver teaching. Out of reciprocity, there was no causality involved whatsoever. And if you can follow this at all, in the same way, identity is a false appearance. It doesn't occur. What occurs precisely is similarity. And so in a ritual comportment, where the issues are not only life and death, not only sanity and madness, but existence itself with all of its perils, life itself must be honored and maintained. Otherwise, it's not going to occur. She will not continue her dance. There will be nobody to receive him. There will be nothing. All of that is dependent upon the accuracy of ritual and the ability of the medicine person to convey that one does not look for identity. Identities are signs of errors coming. One looks for similarities, and there's always a distinctiveness. And the closer the similarities are, the more workable they are, and the more they relieve in ever finer differences. And one hones in this way to the point where one accepts that one needs help, a transcendent divine help, because the similarities are so refined that one is stuck in thinking that they're the same, and yet one knows they're not exactly, precisely the same. And that's where the divine powers, the supernatural, comes in to help. One doesn't need the help because one is helpless. One needs the help because one knows one is not helpless and comes to the limits of one's ability to refine similarity. And so primordial men and women ask for divine help, not out of helplessness, but out of excellence, out of really courageous refinement. And because of the dignity of their appeal, because of the legitimacy and the accuracy of the nature of their cry for help, the prayers were answered and the help came. Not out of causality, not because the gods were compelled to do this, but because they replied. Because reciprocity is a universal principle. That if one reaches out legitimately, there's always a hand to reach for yours. One doesn't find the divine, one meets the divine. Whatever you're looking for is looking for you, and if there is an equanimity, there's a discovery. There's a mutuality. And so all ritual in wisdom is characterized by reciprocity, an exchange. And the reciprocity is on basis not of things that have identity, but on objects that have their own similarity, and that there are whole families of similarity levels where there are resonances. Resonances because the stars are right, resonances because the earth is right, resonances for all kinds of levels of order. And so a ritual master is extremely wise about heaven and earth, about reciprocity and similarity, about life and existence, and helps it go. One of the great ritual ceremonies of the North American Indians was always the sun dance, in the Algonquin language called the Okan. And the trigger, not the cause, but the trigger of the reciprocity, is made in midwinter by a holy woman, by a woman who, out of the tribe, feels the need to call for the help of the sun. And so in midwinter, some woman who makes a vow that she will sponsor the sun dance in the summer at the solstice. She will sponsor it by her ability to maintain a holy acceptance for the duration of the ceremony for the entire tribe, so that there is a chance for the efficacy of the ceremony to happen. But some man will have to be paired with her acceptance. The holy woman's acceptance will have to be the courage of some man in that tribe, who at midsummer, when the vertical pole is set up, he will have to sacrifice his essence of existence. And that sacrifice will only be efficacious if he does it in the context of her vow. And we'll see how the sun dance is miraculous example of way in which a ritual is comprehensive on very wise level, nothing primitive about it at all, understands life better than most people now do. The section of the Sacred Pipe, the Sundance section, chapter 5, is something you might take a look at in the coming week. And again, chapter 5 of Gladys Reichardt's book. 2 chapter 5s, Legends and Sand Paintings of the Male Shooting Chant, The Visit to the Sun. So next week, a pair of texts about the sun and the tribe and ritual and life and existence and reciprocity and similarity and the perils of going between limited and unlimited, between a preemptive ego that thinks it's it, or thinks there's an it that's it. Or sometimes thinks you have it and it wants it from you at any cost. All kinds of perils. Same cause. Not cause, same reciprocity. So appearance and reality have an interplay. And in ritual, it comes into the focus. It comes within the ken of a focus in the ceremony. The ceremony is like a threshing floor where all the problems that have to be tended to are there together now. And all of us can do something about it permanently now. This is our chance together. And so the ritual ceremony, like a sun dance, is a coming together of men and women for single, central, shared purpose to do what is necessary now, here, for our life to continue in the existence that we actually have. This is worthwhile. The central symbol, sometimes in Hegelian philosophical terms called synthesizing symbol. The central symbol is like an essential thread that goes all the way through, but one cannot find that thread preemptively. One has to discover it. And so in order to discover the symbol, one has to have the experience first. And in order to have the experience first, one has to do the action first. You have to do something. And so the doing of the ritual is indispensable context for the having of the experience, for the finding of the symbol. And so ritual, myth, and symbol all go together, but they are all held by the mystery of nature, and so nature must be included all the time. And so ritual comportment always has a referential homage to nature. The reference of all ritual implements, of all mythic images, are always to nature. Always. Dante, in his great theory of poetry, said the first requirement of a fantastic poet is to understand that his images must be from nature. If they're fictive, a lot of problems are going to come out of that. Making up epics of maturation is very bad business, very deep peril. And egotistical imaginations of maturation are the devil's own playground. We do not have carte blanche. We have nature as it really is, mysterious enough, and we have ritual comportment as complex as it really is. And within that are just the beginnings of experience, and even beyond that, the understanding of the essence, the symbol. Where does the hand of comprehension hold this? Where would you hold it to convey it? The hand always comes to the body. It is the body that is the place where ritual manifestation really happens. The doing of the doing is what is the body doing. One pays attention to, in Satipatthana, not so much that you're meditating and on nirvana or whatever, but what is the body doing? What is it precisely doing? And so a little code here, a little wetting of the finger. It's the doing of the doing that one needs to attend to. And so in a good ritual, one is absorbed in the ritual. Remember the sand painting, and the sick person goes on the sand painting and corresponds their body to the sand painting, becomes absorbed precisely. We become the saturation element in the symbol, and that's how the symbol transforms into consciousness. And when it does, it carries us with it. We become immersed in the experience, in the language, in the myth that is engendered by the ritual action. And at the essence of that, at the refining fire of that, is the symbol that when the transformation happens, the big transformation, it carries us with it. And we are cured permanently, not just Band-Aid, not just here and now, but permanently. American Protestant word, delivered. Hellenistic influence word, salvation. It's this quality of curing which is like an eternal help. It's a reciprocity on level of cure, not just adjusting. The ego is happy to adjust because it gets to continue its portfolio of stuff. We don't have to call it anything else, it's stuff. So it likes weekend workshops that help you to adjust, but does not like cures. No more sugar. Lose taste for sugar. Like pure water, fresh vegetables. No candy bars? So ego has good reason to fear wisdom, because wisdom pulls its plug. And so the addictive quality of false world, of swirls of samsara, do not like fresh wind of wisdom. Real education's bad news. Not only does it clear out stuff we really like to have around, but clears out and pushes us into transformation through, we know there are perils. We don't want to go. Yet there are times when we have to go. There are times of birth, or illness, or crisis, or death, or tragedy, or travail. We have no choice. We have to go. And in those times, at those thresholds, men and women sober up and bring the courage out of heaven and bring the determination out of earth and do it. And together they go through. Always have. That's how we got here. We got this far because our forebears, our ancestors were able to do this. And to do it on level of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years effectively. So we have a lot of treasure trove. We have a heritage that's unbelievably splendorous. It's not narrow little path that's precarious anymore. There's 20-lane freeway. But you have that way to go. There's still a lot of terrain on the outside, very difficult. So ritual has a peculiar quality to it. Ritual has reciprocity, the accuracy of which is similarity, so that correspondences are really important. And because correspondences are important, slight differences emerge only after long time sometimes, and so one has to have repetition. One has repetition not for dullness, but repetition so that when the slightest difference occurs, one can recognize it. And so a ritual is characterized by repetition, manifested as the drum, the rhythm of the real, manifested in the drum, and the reciprocity, which has something to do with the mask. So reciprocity and repetition are like structural elements of ritual. They belong in existence and they are necessary for life. And when life is cared for in this way, it flourishes. Life flourishes. Life on our level flourishes. It's brushed up, it's freshened, and steps to next level with a spring instead of the peril. And what is the next level? What's the next phase in that phase form? Myth, language, experience. And so experience becomes real because something has been done for real in a nature which is mysteriousness, allows for this reality to occur. Right now, we're looking at the way in which, as Gladys Reichhardt says, the ritual is efficacious for the person who accepts not only the action, but accepts the chanting. The chanting is like the linchpin that holds the spokes of the cycle of ritual together. One is cured because one has been sung over. These objects are sacred because they have been sung over. But the chant, which is the generic name that was adopted in the 19th century, and as Gladys Reichhardt says, it's as good as any other word. It was incidentally fortified by the great mystical genius who was there in the Department of Indian Affairs after the Civil War. You know, Lincoln, like Jefferson, was going to pay attention to the American Indians after the Civil War was over, and his assassination ended that. Always seems that the United States gets to the brink of greatness and doesn't carry through. But there was a young clerk who temporarily was in the department, the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C., who received all the deputations from the American Indian tribes who brought them to the Lincoln, who was supposed to be still alive and there. And that man in the Department of Indian Affairs who received those depositions was Walt Whitman. Because the United States is a mystical adventure of the divine, and not just some paltry thing, not just some nationalistic opportunity, but the great experiment as to whether there can be a scientific cosmos on scale of whole star system. The United States is bound up in that mystery play. And Whitman is the one who used the term chant. In many of Whitman's longer poems, he called chants, based on American Indian wisdom rhythms. And the way to read a lot of Whitman's long chants is with the cadence of the mythological voice of the American Indian. One of the great little short poems of Whitman called Red Jacket from Aloft, were cognizing the way in which these ritual wisdoms were so misunderstood by the greedy, falsely urbanized Americans collected around the habit of just making false commemorations. In New York City, they were unveiling a statue to an Indian chief named Red Jacket, and they were making all these pompous speeches before the cloth was unveiled for the statue. And there was Whitman listening to all the hyperbole, all the crap, all the stuff, and all the endless political speeches. And then when the canvas fell, there was the royal, noble visage of Red Jacket, who was the greatest orator of the Iroquois nation of all time. And Whitman said everyone for a split second was transfixed by the silent nobility of someone who really knew how to speak truth in the chant, the curing chant. And then quickly their egos sloughed it over, forgot about it, and everybody went back to the false ceremony of the supposed unveiling, except Whitman, who in the poem said, beyond the din of the false, there was the impossible reality of Red Jacket viewing them from aloft. Eloquent in his silence, for what could he say to such a crowd? What could they ever hear? It was Whitman who used the term chant, and so chant was carried on in the Bureau of American Ethnology, and so all these are called chants because of that. That's the way reality happens sometimes. That's the way wisdom is transferred. When it's really necessary, someone is there. That's the lesson of the Bhagavad Gita. When life itself is imperiled, then a Krishna is sent. And when Krishna is sent, is met by an Arjuna every single time. For life has victory indeed. In this rhythm and repetition of the drum, in this reciprocity of the mask, we need to concentrate on the mask just for a moment, because there's something mysterious in the way in which a mask is a locus on the membrane of our real self. The mask to the ego is chance to parade, to be a falsity. In fact, the whole Iroquois origin of the mask has something to do with the myth of false face, which we talked about 2 weeks ago. You can get a tape and listen to that. But the mask, as the Iroquois knew, someone like Red Jacket would have been able to speak. Someone like Whitman would have been able to hear. The mask is not a false face. The mask is a locus on the membrane of our real self, which at that point is unknowable and thus naturally hidden from us. But the mask is the first place where we can get some traction, where we can begin to be attentive enough and get acquainted with the membrane at that point, well enough that we can recognize the membrane when we meet it again, wherever it is, and slowly build up the gestalt of who we really are. And so the mask is the first place with which the journey of 1,000 miles has begun. It's the first step. It's the first locus of the real in terms of ourself. But as we'll see in this education, a year from now, a whole year from now, a whole cycle of 4 seasons from now, our real self is a person that occurs as a prism in the differential field of consciousness and is no thing in the integral process at all. No one ever found themselves by integrating. What you find by integrating, when you do it precisely and exactly all the way through, is nirvana, nothing, shunyata. That's what you find. When you take ekagrata to its infinite exactness, one finds nothing at all. And yet, out of that, the whole cosmos of splendor occurs. Not out of causality, but out of reciprocity. When a life being presents nothingness to the real responds by presenting everythingness. But that's a long ways away. And it's too much to gulp. We're drowned. It'd be an avalanche of too much. It's better to proceed and let the phases disclose each other in a way in which is commensurate with their happening. On the ritual level, what's important for us is to listen to Gladys Reichard in her recounting of the way in which an old Navajo medicine man named, the name that most people knew him as was Miguelito. But he was known late in his life as Red Point because there was an outcropping of a mesa near his home. And because when you sighted certain star constellations over his home, it always sighted through the Red Point. So he was called Red Point by the Indians. That was his name. An Indian name always reflects the differential reality of the person in terms of the cosmic locus, not just your name from the lineage of mother and father or your name which they gave you, but the name which is yours because of the way in which the focus of the universe is on you. And everyone has that real name. And to find that name is part of the mystery of the divine. In Peter Weir's film, The Last Wave, the old Aborigine medicine man asks Richard Chamberlain, playing the lawyer from Sydney, he says, "Who are you? Who are you? Who are you?" And Richard Chamberlain, in the film, dissolves out of his lawyer ego role and realizes for the first time in his life he doesn't know who he is. He has no idea. But he finds out. Ritual has an uncanny way of disclosing the right experience, and in that experience is hidden the symbol, which is the key for opening up the whole differential consciousness of vision. So ritual has something to do with vision. And unless one does the ritual with total dedication, with as much exactness as can be had, shared with reciprocity, with repetition and rhythm, the experience will not be there. And without the experience, without the cloud of language, there's no lightning of realization. And without that, how are you going to see? More next week.